Um, Thank you so much. Thank you, Lamont. Thank you, everyone who had a hand in getting me here. Thank you all for coming. You know, one of the things I like to say before I give any lecture in public, for one thing, I like to butter up the crowd and remind people that how gorgeous you're looking, so that you'll enjoy the talk that much better. But also, I really believe that it is an unbelievable privilege to have anyone show up to listen to what you have to say. So I'm charmed by your presence. I really am. I won't give too much of an introduction to the talk that I'm about to give you, except to say that for a variety of reasons that we can talk about in the question and answer, I've gotten interested in Jonestown and what the legacy of Jonestown actually is for our generations. It seems quite resonant with where we are as a culture, I mean American people specifically. In 2018, we are in crazy times. But I will say that I had actually thought about doing a PowerPoint presentation. One of the things I'm trying to do is become a little bit more modern in terms of how I do public presentations, but I specifically decided not to do that as there are the people who are my age and a little bit younger than me will remember from 1978 the incidents were splashed all over the media, so hundreds of bodies piled on top of each other and decomposing. And so I didn't want to do that for reasons, just because it's not the ethical thing to do, to continue to use those images, and also because I didn't want to repeat some of the problems, I think, with Jonestown, period. And then the last thing I'll say is that this section, this paper I'm going to read to you takes about 45 minutes, so settle yourselves. And it's divided into two sections. And because I'm a very, very sophisticated man, the sections are entitled 1 and 2. 1. On November 18th, 1978, in a settlement of the San Francisco-based People's Temple known informally as Jonestown, after the temple's founder, Jim Jones, some 918 persons either committed suicide or were murdered. The settlement of approximately 3,000 acres was 150 miles from the Guyanese capital of Georgetown and close to the country's disputed border with Venezuela. It had begun some years prior as both the temple and its minister began to lose favor within the mainstream of San Francisco civil society. Jones had previously been appointed chairman of the City Housing Authority after the election of Mayor George Moscone in a contest in which the active participation of members of the People's Temple proved decisive. After a series of highly critical newspaper articles and the defection of key temple members, however, Jones and other People's Temple leaders decided to establish a Caribbean missionary post in Guyana. In an act of what some temple members referred to as revolutionary suicide, most of the victims consumed a concoction of powdered fruit punch mixed with sedatives and cyanide. These poisonings followed the shootings of 5 other victims at the nearby Port Kaituma airstrip, including Leo Ryan, congressman from the 11th District of California. Ryan had arrived the day before in response to claims by family members of Jonestown residents that their relatives were in danger, as well as ongoing investigations into the financial dealings of both Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Perhaps even more importantly, Jones was involved in a custody battle with ex-church member Grace Stone, the estranged wife of former People's Temple attorney Timothy Stone. When Grace fled the group in July of 1976, she left behind her child, John Victor Stone, fearing that the boy might be harmed if she attempted to remove him. Complicating matters, shortly after the Stone child's birth, Timothy Stone filed an affidavit stating that not he, but instead Jones, was in fact the boy's biological father. Grace Stone did, however, eventually win her court battle in the California courts. Nonetheless, Jones continued to represent himself as the rightful custodian of young John, refusing to turn him over to his mother. As a consequence, he effectively trapped himself in Guyana, as he would face contempt charges should he return to the United States. This was the situation that Congressman Ryan faced as he entered the settlement on November 17th for what was universally reported as an uneventful visit. As he was attempting to leave the following day, however, several members of the temple approached him and asked to travel with his party. This led to an attempt on Ryan's life with a knife by a male temple member. The congressman survived the attack, but later, as the group was boarding their planes, they were ambushed, leaving the congressman and 4 others dead. Following this disaster, Jones called his followers to the settlement's pavilion, where the poisoned punch was administered first to children, then adults. Within days, much of the world saw the harrowing images of hundreds of bodies, face down on the ground, bloated and decomposing in the heat of the Guyanese jungle. The Jonestown incident, hardly remembered today, remains forever marked in U.S., South American, and Caribbean history as the largest mass suicide in modern times and the largest single loss of U.S. civilian life before the attacks of September 11, 2001. I want to pause here to tarry with the complex questions of temporality and agency the consideration of Jonestown provokes. To be blunt, the rhetoric of revolutionary suicide was not first and foremost a product of Jim Jones or the other architects of the ideological and rhetorical structures that surrounded and helped establish the People's Temple. Revolutionary suicide was, in fact, the title of the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton's 1973 autobiography. Moreover, the belief that one might rightly and virtuously die for the movement was well articulated in the US-based Black Power movement. Perhaps even more to the point, the idea of enslaved persons throwing themselves from ships into the Atlantic or mothers killing their own children in order to protect them from yoke and lash is well established as an understandable necessity within the long struggle against enslavement and colonization. The question becomes then, where exactly in the long historical arc that has created the contemporary communities of the United States does the ending of one's life or the ending of the lives of one's children cease to be recognized as an desperate act of resistance and become instead a mark of base desperation, clumsiness, idiocy, and moral laxity? How does the rhetoric of our living in the afterlife of slavery, in the wake of slavery, or simply in the modern articulation of slave culture, function when acts of violent desperation take place deep within the 20th and 21st centuries? I find it interesting, surprising really, that in a moment in Black cultural studies in which questions of Black life, social death, necropolitics, and pessimism are so brilliantly debated, that we've seen so little consideration of the Jonestown incident. The memorialization processes that one imagines ought to attend the loss of nearly 1,000 souls, most of them African American, is roundly and tellingly absent. While a number of individuals, most notably the poet M. Bessie Phillip, have rightly brought back into public consideration the 1781 massacre in which 133 Africans were thrown overboard the slave ship Zong so that the ship's captain and his investors might collect insurance money for their lost cargo, there has been no such celebrated reconsideration of the lives of the Jonestown settlers. My suspicion is that the difference in the treatment of these events turns not only on questions of culpability and agency, but also on what we might call legibility. The slaves of the Zong were victims caught up in a system of transatlantic commerce that they presumably did not understand. They left no direct record of themselves. They were remembered as a group, unnamed humans come objects. The Jonestown settlers, on the other hand, were either perpetrators or fools, killing themselves and their children in an act that was presumably equal parts desperation and stupidity. Even more to the point, these were individuals for whom the question of what Orlando Patterson calls social death was, if not moot, at least bracketed. The residents of Jonestown had names recorded in the official registers of both the United States and Guyana. They were citizens, many of whose Social Security checks provided the working capital of the settlement. The uncertainty of what Patterson calls natal alienation was disrupted, or at least troubled, by the fact of the very well-organized efforts of what was known as the Concerned Relatives Organization, an organization whose efforts eventually compelled Congressman Ryan to leave California for Guyana. It is important to remember in this regard that the People's Temple was hardly a fringe organization in 1970s America. In addition to Jim Jones's appointment to the San Francisco Housing Authority, the church at various times received significant and often vocal support from prominent Californians, including Jerry Brown, Huey Newton, Angela Davis, Willie Brown, and Harvey Milk, among others. Temple members were particularly skilled at representing the interests and beliefs of the church within the larger community. Thousands of flyers and letters were sent out regularly to potential supporters, especially individuals who had attended temple services. The church was also careful to curry the favor of key members of the U.S. political and cultural elite, focusing on those persons whom they believed shared their interracialist and liberationist goals. In a letter dated 10 June 1975, Richard D. Trop, a key lieutenant of Jim Jones, wrote to the celebrated novelist and activist James Baldwin, praising him for his remarkable work. Dear Mr. Baldwin, Pastor Jones asked me to write you to express our church's profound appreciation of the work you have done over the years to help all of us know ourselves better. Your great courage and searing honesty in writing about the Black experience and sexual self-awareness finds perhaps no equal in American letters. We especially want to let you know that your example, influence, and inspiration is keenly felt here. Pastor Jones quotes often from your work, and our hundreds of young people have been encouraged to read your books. Here at People's Temple, we put a very high premium on personal honesty. Many of our services take the form of catharses in which individuals have faced problems and, in an environment of support and understanding, have overcome them. Our group exemplifies a level of interracial harmony and tolerance which goes far beyond the usual niceties and token demonstration of concern. We have many interracial marriages, many who, following the example of Pastor and Mrs. Jones, have adopted and taken in children of many races. We have not given up on the vision of a multi-ethnic society based on honesty, love, sharing, and equality. May you continue to provide, in these tumultuous days, a source of light and awareness that the world so desperately needs. We hope that some of the enclosed notices of our work may serve as a testimony of hope in a world that often seems to conspire against us. Pastor and Mrs. Jones send their deepest gratitude and esteem. Sincerely yours, Richard D. Trop, assistant to the pastor, People's Temple Christian Church, and instructor in English and American Literature, Santa Rosa Junior College, Santa Rosa, California. I've taken the opportunity to reproduce this remarkable document in order to restate the matter of legibility to which I referred earlier. It is the prettiness of Trop's prose, as well as the seamless resonance of his message with contemporary American liberal and progressive thought, that gives one pause. Through Trop, Jim Jones affirms Baldwin's positive treatment of the Black experience and his courageous championing of what Trop styles sexual self-awareness. This is met by interracialism, multiculturalism, enlightened self-critique, public service, and even transracial adoption. We find, moreover, that members of the temple are sophisticated consumers of literature and film, a point that is underscored by the fact that Richard Trop is both assistant to Pastor Jones and an instructor of English and American literature at Santa Rosa Junior College. Or to jump, perhaps, a bit too quickly to one of this essay's primary conclusions, the reason that we have so little interest in making sense of this tragedy has to do with the fact that the offensiveness of the People's Temple and the Jonestown settlement turns on the reality that church members utilized with great skill the very ideological and discursive structures that so many of us take to be precious. Victim or perpetrator, contemporary agent of history or non-subject made numb and inarticulate by the sting of the lash, assessing what one is actually experiencing when looking at an image of a bloated body in the public yard of the Jonestown settlement is in many ways even more difficult than attending to the tragedy of the 133 victims of the Zong. The material archive left by the People's Temple is in no way scant or scattered. Unlike the impersonal cargo records and dehumanizing court documents of the Zong, the archives of the Jonestown event are varied and plentiful. Thus, I will repeat my contention that the reason that we cannot make sense of the motivations of the congregants of the People's Temple or the settlers at Jonestown may be nothing more exotic or complicated than the fact that we may know and understand them too well. Unlike the Zong victims, one must ask not only about the culpability of the Jonestown settlers and their own deaths, but also whether the deficiencies and frailties that presumably precipitated the incidents of November 18, 1978, are also a part of the culture that we all now share. I will say straightforwardly at this point that I think that the Jonestown settlers were wrong. It is wrong to look into the face of your child, to see reflected there the face of a parent, a grandparent, the faces of unknown generations, to caress that child's smooth cheek with one's right hand, and to offer it a cup of poison with the left. I cannot, however, comfort myself with the simple belief that this action was mad. Nor do I believe that there is an innate and irrefutable logic attached to the profound distaste that we feel when considering the actions of the People's Temple and its founder, Jim Jones. Instead, the suicides and murders at Jonestown represent a funhouse mirror image of narratives of subjectivity and resistance that continue to be vibrantly alive within the basic discursive structures of Europe, Africa, and the Americas, particularly discursive structures produced within the crucibles of slavery and colonization. The killing of one's kin on a South American plantation in 1778 might be understood as at once regretful and noble, while the killing of one's kin on the same plantation in 1978 is a thing that provokes shock and revulsion. The problem, however, is that we have not quite settled the matter of what the ontological, epistemological, and indeed historical differences between the two actions actually are. We have not created a clear distinction between the enslaved and their descendants, noted with clarity and rigor how the anger and frustration of human chattel ought to be distinguished from the anger and frustration of that chattel's children and grandchildren. In a final letter penned by Richard Tropp as he witnessed hundreds of deaths at the Jonestown settlement, we see a quite articulate statement of the belief that the settlers were neither obscene nor irrational, but instead keenly aware of the most advanced forms of progressive thought. Please try to understand, Tropp writes. This was a monument to life, to the human spirit, broken by capitalism, by a system of exploitation and injustice. Look at all that was built by a beleaguered people. We did not want this kind of ending. We wanted to live, to shine, to bring light to a world that is dying for a little bit of love. To those left behind of our loved ones, many of whom will not understand, who never knew this truth, grieve not. We are grateful for this opportunity to bear witness, a bitter witness. History has chosen our destiny in spite of our desire to forge our own. We were at cross purpose with history. but we are calm in this hour of our collective leave-taking. As I write these lines, people are silently amassed, taking a quick potion, inducing sleep, relief. We are a long-suffering people. Many of us are weary with a long search, a long struggle, going back not only in our lifetime, but a long, painful heritage. Trop makes it absolutely clear that he understands the struggle at Jonestown to be one and the same with a centuries-long struggle to resist a system of exploitation and injustice established within a long, painful heritage of abuse and suffering. That is to say, the rhetoric that he uses is exactly the same as that used by many progressives, particularly progressive intellectuals. I continue to reiterate this none too pleasant or comfortable point because I believe that doing so edges us toward a better understanding of the hesitation that many working class and poor communities have to much of the liberationist rhetoric associated with the 1960s and 70s. Indeed, one of the things that is important to admit when considering the Jonestown tragedy is that it was not simply a generic loss of American life. Instead, it was an especially provocative example of the continued demise of left progressive culture in the United States. The People's Temple and the Jonestown settlement were not only interracialist, but also self-consciously anti-capitalist and socialist. Prior to the tragedy, they were simply one of the many experiments with new forms of community and communality that came directly out of the civil rights, Black Power, anti-war, feminist, LGBTQ, and anti-nuclear movements of the 1960s and 1970s. More to the point, the tragedy of Jonestown extended well beyond the discarded bodies of the 918 dead to encompass a quickly moving rightward retrenchment in American politics, a retrenchment that reached its zenith with the election of former California Governor Ronald Reagan to the US presidency. Reagan's successful campaign slogan, "It's Morning in America," specifically referenced Jonestown and the many other communes and other alternative forms of community that developed in the US as Americans attempted to enact modes of habitation and comportment that did not produce the violent protocols of class, race, gender, and sexuality that had and have such a tenacious hold on the culture. Adding serious insult to profound injury, the success of the 1980 Republican presidential and congressional campaigns owed a great debt to the party's deft manipulation of congregations of evangelical megachurches with their dynamic and often televisually appealing ministers, who in most particulars favored the dynamic Jim Jones, but who now very much distanced themselves from progressive politics and culture in favor of masculinism, opposition to LGBTQ rights, and most importantly, the unabashedly pro-capitalist gospel of prosperity pioneered by evangelists like Fred Price and Kenneth Copeland. 2. I would like to remind you of the politics quotient of the radical philosopher Achille Mbembe's neologism, necropolitics. While those of us who huddle in what we take to be the more advanced precincts of U.S. social and cultural criticism are often brightly attuned to the idea that, quote, to exercise sovereignty is to exercise control over mortality, end quote, we are often far too quick to concede a static conception of the sovereign. We forget that sovereignty is first and foremost a fiction, a deliberate attempt to obscure the ways in which control over both human life and the resources that support that life are always hotly, even desperately contested. The robes of the king, the silk and brocade that adorn his body, the jewels that weigh his hands, are themselves evidence of a need to disguise the facts that not only is the individual whose visage we continually encounter on television screens and currency notes nothing more than a man, but also that the remarkable violence marshaled in order to protect and reiterate his prerogatives is itself a reaction to resistances to domination that cannot be contained within normative forms of discourse and social interaction. As Mbembe following Paul Gilroy reminds us, the resistant epistemological systems growing out of forms of extreme dominance and exploitation are always asynchronous. They do not, that is, link in any logical manner with the epistemological systems that announce and indeed celebrate the protocols of domination. Thus, for the enslaved and the colonized, there is no clear path to mutual recognition and agreement with their oppressors. That is to say, they cannot easily become identifiable subjects. Instead, they must establish modes of resistance that might be rightly seen as outrageous and mad, precisely because they do not reaffirm either their presumed subhumanity or the master's comically thin claims to natural authority. To state the matter plainly, the resistance techniques of the oppressed are hard to read and nearly impossible to understand, and perhaps even more to the point, one finds it awkward and impracticable to press them to the service of mourning and memorialization. 1 second, please. I have argued that the Zong massacre is a much more consumable piece of African diasporic tragedy than the Jonestown incidents because of the fact that it comes to us from a great distance. Its actors are not so much forgotten as flattened out, becoming in the process fetching illustrations of transatlantic, transhistoric calamity. Their very inability to speak makes them available as ciphers for the most eloquent forms of expression. The colonists at Jonestown are likewise inarticulate beings, yet nonetheless they cannot be made to shut up. The images of hundreds of bloated bodies rotting in the heat of the fall Guyanese sun disallow the ataraxia, the tranquility evoked by the vision of the spirits of our ancestral dead forever entombed by the cold profundity of the Atlantic. The colonists, however, can never, and perhaps should never, be memorialized because they cannot be made to speak properly, cannot be persuaded to confer coherent meaning. Ranged as they were in the wilds of Guyana, they were at best savages, incomprehensible in their animal state, and at worst madmen, whose sacrifice of their own bodies was but one step removed from the suicide bomber hurling her own self-loathing outward toward the innocent and the sane. If, however, you have followed my arguments thus far, you will understand that what I am proposing is that the Jonestown colonists did not retreat from the political. On the contrary, they engaged politics and political discourse by demonstrating with their suicides that there are indeed workable, if certainly distasteful, answers to the lopsided protocols of sovereignty in which they found themselves enmeshed. Their self-destruction was, I argue, a profoundly assertive and even forward-thinking act that we still cannot consider as such because of the fact that it so disrupts our own conceptions of sovereignty and self-possession, conceptions that the rotting bodies of the colonists name as outmoded lies. I should have perhaps begun my comments by asking how the progressive scholar of African American and African diasporic culture might engage with the unspeakability of the Jonestown incident, the ways in which their actions make it nearly impossible for us to grieve and remember. Writing of this phenomenon in 1984, the late poet Pat Barker makes a similar claim, quote, "It is amazing to me that we have not demanded better explanations of what happened. As I travel and talk to people, I find that most of them do not believe what they have been told, yet we still know very little. I must ask the question, if 900 white people had gone to a country with a black minister and committed suicide, would we have accepted the answers we were given so easily?" End quote. You will forgive me as I push a bit against the logic of Parker's rhetoric in order to answer yes. It seems, in fact, that the cultish behavior of white Americans would be easier to accept because of the fact that as individuals who presumably once had the potential to be interpolated as normative subjects, their drift from this normativity, their turn from accepted forms of sociality to madness, might be understandable as but an unfortunate, if somewhat expected, deviation from established modes of being and understand. For the black non-subject, however, particularly the black poor, yet striving, and potentially revolutionary non-subject of the People's Temple, there was no easy way to parse the distinction between their blackness, their anti-normativity, and their presumed madness. To do so would be akin to attempting to distinguish one species of static from another. In Jonestown, the title poem of Parker's remarkable 1985 collection, Jonestown and Other Madness, the poet struggles madly to make sense of the actions of the colonists in a long, angry, richly evocative, but I believe ultimately unsuccessful poem. Parker repeatedly stresses her lack of belief in the standard narratives of the events of November 18th. An interview with a live one. You were a member of the People's Temple? Yes, I was. Why did you join? Well, I went there a few times and then I stopped going, but the Reverend Jones came by my house and asked me why I quit coming. I was really surprised. No one had ever cared that much about me before. No one had ever cared that much about me before. And it came home. The message of my youth came clear. The black people in the Jonestown did not commit suicide. They were murdered. They were murdered in small southern towns. They were murdered in big northern cities. They were murdered as school children by teachers who didn't care. They were murdered by welfare workers who didn't care. They were murdered by shopkeepers who didn't care. They were murdered by church people who didn't care. They were murdered by politicians who didn't care. They didn't die at Jonestown. They went to Jonestown dead, convinced that America and Americans didn't care. They died in the schoolrooms, in the streets. They died in the bars. They died in the jails. They died in the churches. They died in the welfare lines. Jim Jones was not the cause. He was the result of 400 years of not caring. Black folks do not. Black folks do not. Black folks do not commit suicide. I think it best that I simply admit that what I resist in this poem is how seductive I find it. One might take solace in the idea that suicide is a white thing, that while black people, or at least black American people, may drug, drink, and eat ourselves to death, while we may occasionally even murder comrades and kin, that in the face of centuries of continual assault, we never take our own lives. Or to follow the logic of Parker's poem, the sentences that we use to explain the abrupt cessation of black life are overpopulated with nominatives. Small southern towns, big northern cities, teachers, welfare workers, shopkeepers, church people, politicians, schoolrooms, streets, bars, jails, and churches all point in one direction toward an accusative object. Black folks who exist in the poem only as negative subjects, beings who cannot resist because they seemingly cannot act at all. Black folks do not. Black folks do not. Black folks do not commit suicide. The problem, of course, is that this line of thought flies not only squarely in the face of the work of generations of progressive discourse, particularly that of scholars of enslavement, who have argued that even within the most severe forms of policing and containment, black individuals have struggled and nourished their humanity, indeed their free will, but also that the fact that black hands built the People's Temple, black backs hold the concrete and timber that held together the settlement, black labor and cunning financed the day-to-day operations, and finally, black hands administered the poison that sealed the name Jonestown into its ignoble position within world history. The question that Jonestown forces us to consider is whether or not we believe in good times and bad, and moments of both honor and ignominy, that black subjectivity, human subjectivity, is inviolable. It turns us, in fact, toward two traditions of thought. One that focuses on the matter of bare life, simple biological life, the life to which one presumably clings in the concentration camp, and a second that privileges more extensive conceptions of life under extreme pressure, pointing to the black life that, though trapped within centuries of horror on the plantations, was nonetheless vibrant and resistant. I align myself forthrightly with the latter. Indeed, what I've attempted to resist in my discussion of Jonestown, and what I criticize in the work of even as gifted a poet as Pat Parker, is a tendency to retreat to old-fashioned notions of African American identity, such that Black subjectivity seems to disappear under the most punishing types of stress. Black folks do not. Black folks do not. I will close then with a brief discussion of the matter of memory and memorialization. In doing so, however, I acknowledge that while it would be both vulgar and needlessly provocative to suggest that my contemporary interlocutors are in any way responsible for the mass ritual killing that took place on November 18, 1978, near the western border of Guyana, it is the case that we are in fact responsible for helping to make meaning of it. The spirit of destruction that stalked and consumed the people of Jonestown is always hungry and ever vigilant. It is a creature unhampered by space or time. It is not, however, all-powerful. It can be, if not defeated, then at least contained by complex, ever-changing combinations of imagination, resilience, and practicality. I turn then toward Wilson Harris's fine 1996 novel titled simply, like Pat Parker's poem from a decade before, Jonestown. In doing so, I wish to remark the fact that the Jonestown tragedy was not simply an African-American affair, but also a world historic event that we need to make sense of because it so eerily presages some of the most disturbing tendencies of our own time. Wilson Harris is often spoken of as one of the finest writers Guyana has ever produced. At the same time, his highly exploratory style is regarded as extremely challenging. This is exacerbated by the fact that he often takes up themes of colonial conquest and domination, but he does so in a manner that privileges surrealism and mysticism. Thus, his novels and essays are both difficult to read and difficult to measure. Indeed, the inscrutability of his work parallels the inscrutability of the actions of the settlers themselves. The novel, Jonestown, is tellingly narrated from the vantage point of Francisco Bone, one of the lieutenants of the character Jonah Jones, the cynical white religious leader who led his mainly Black congregants to the edge of the Guyana Amazon. As such, Bone becomes a reiteration of Richard Trop, the white chronicler of the People's Temple, whose two eloquent letters we have examined already. Unlike Trop, however, Bone is figured as both Black and Guyanese, building Harris's case that Jonestown was itself a continuation of transnational practices of both colonialism and resistance to colonialism. Moreover, unlike Parker, Harris notes both the centuries-long durée of resistance, as well as the fact that Blackness itself is a concept and always is as a concept in always already intimate connection to the rest of humanity. Excuse me. Talk amongst yourselves for 1 second. I'll read the last sentence again. Moreover, unlike Parker, Harris notes both the centuries-long array of resistance as well as the fact that Blackness is itself a concept in always already intimate connection to the rest of humanity. Quote, the mixed peoples of African or Indian or European or Chinese descent who live in modern Guyana today are related to the Aboriginal ghost of the past, if not by strict biological kinship, then by ties to the specter of erosion of community and place which haunts the Central and South Americas, end quotes. Harris then relentlessly presses this point forward, suggesting that Jonestown was not simply an effect of American-style anti-Black racism, but instead of generations of struggle against a will to dominate and destroy that was recognized and treated with great clarity by our Aboriginal forebears. That is to say, Jonestown was but one grisly salvo in an ancient and elemental fight. Thus, Bone's plan is to write a book about the Jonestown massacre entitled Imagine, Dead, Imagine, that treats the incidents of November 18th as a story that did not exist out of time per se, but within all time, or more precisely stated, within the flattened time imagined by the earliest inhabitants of Guyana, in which past and present exist in equal correlation, and the real enemy, the so-called predator, is continually present, always stalking, goading his victims to find ever more clever and precise methods to name, narrate, and thereby avoid or at least ameliorate his destruction. As a consequence, the surreal novel is built upon a conceit of time travel in which Bone trips between November 18th, 1978, and the night decades before in which his own mother was murdered. Even so, Jonestown is a long novel in which very little happens. There is no grand narrative of the death-taking. Instead, the magic of Harris's extremely difficult work is that one understands from the very beginning that this is not simply a story about the massacres of 918 people, nor even a story about the difficulties of writing from within the cauldron of colonialism and slavery, but instead a work that flaunts a refusal to treat so-called Black history within philosophical and critical forms from which Black subjectivity is already excluded. He asks, do we need to cultivate wholly different philosophies of the imagination to bring us on a wave of the future from which to discern how free or unfree we were in the past and still are in the present? How just or unjust to others we remain? How prone to exploit ourselves and others in the name of high-sounding lies? I will end by answering solidly yes. Bending the rhetoric of this essay, argued that I do not believe that what we need at this juncture is to memorialize the passing of the Jonestown dead, but instead to note simply that their deaths were the results not simply of their destitution and cowardliness, but also of a vindictive response to people intent upon establishing, however incompetently, a wholly different philosophy of the imagination. I would reiterate again, moreover, that we find it so difficult to turn our faces in the direction of their efforts because their struggles and their failures so shockingly and glaringly mirror our own. It is nearly impossible to deride the Jonestown colonists when our own philosophical and imaginative structures have not been and are not enough to erase the image of brown-skinned children trapped in cages, the red, white, and blue standing in somber attention nearby. What I can say for certain, however, is that this deathliness is part and parcel of our heritage, the only heritage we have as many peoples. The vulgar trick that we must attempt to make then is to turn our deaths, especially the ugliest of our deaths, towards something meaningful. We must refuse the impulse to bequeath a pretty history to our future selves, and instead work to give them something sound, brilliant, and useful. Thank you very much.